So this may be a bit of a long video, but I guarantee by the time it's done, you'll have learned something. So why is the Mopar, in my opinion, why is the small block Mopar one of the best hot rod engines, internal combustion engines of all time? Now, in the future, I want to compare the Mopar to other makes, the Fords, the Chevys, the imports, some of the late model engines like the LS. But for right now, I just want to focus on the family of Chrysler engines from a high performance standpoint and show you my reasons why I feel that inch for inch, pound for pound, there is no bigger bang you're going to get for the buck than a small block Mopar. Now let me preface this by saying that up for most of my life, I was a big block Hemi snob. I didn't want to know anything that wasn't, you know, this was the first engine I ever built. That's me, I was 16, and that's my 446 pack, my 69 Charger. And then from that, I went to 426 Hemis. And for 15 years or so, the only engine I would touch was the 426 Hemi. In fact, any technical stuff that you might have read about in the magazines, 426 Hemi stuff in the 90s, early 2000s, I probably wrote it. So that's my background. Then about 10 years ago, I built my first 340. So up until that, I had several 340s, several 360s, a bunch of like regular 318s driving around. And you know, they were good motors. They had a reputation as a giant killer. You know, giant killers, that's the 340 is known as the giant killer. And they ran really good, but I never really paid much attention to them because, well, it's a small block, right? And you know, I'm like mostly a B-body guy, and B-bodies need big blocks. You have to have a big block and a B-body. Then I built my first 340. And the way this thing responded, this is my 73 Roadrunner. The way this thing responded to like just the simplest cam, intake headers, carburetor, blew my mind. I mean, it would run away and hide from, it would at least run toe to toe with, let's say, a 446 pack, the healthy 446 pack. Blew my mind. Why does this thing make so much power with so little effort? And I mean, I literally just slammed this thing together with stuff I had laying around. So that led me to looking into it. What is the unique aspect of the small block Mopar that makes it work the way it does? And after doing some detective work, because again, see, that's my job. I'm supposed to figure these things out and then I'm like, share them. So after doing some detective work back then, I kind of realized that it was an accident, a quirk of the engine's origin, a quirk of its original manufacture that actually turns it into a race motor. Like from the factory, it has the perfect cylinder head architecture to be a race motor. And I'm not talking about anything on the intake side. In fact, the cylinder heads are handicapped on the intake side, which is why the TA heads and then the W2s and all of that came along. But we're not even going to talk about that because that's not where the magic is. And that doesn't really apply to the run-of-the-mill 273, 318, 340, 360 that you guys may come across in the course of your travels. It's all in the exhaust port. So, as I said, I was a big block Mopar guy and then a Hemi guy for most of my life. And this right here, this is a regular 906 casting. It's just the typical big block Mopar casting. And if you're not familiar with these things, but you are familiar with the first generation small block Chevy, the big block Mopar head is really just a scaled up first generation small block Chevy head, but with shaft mounted rockers instead of stud mounted rockers. The intake and the exhaust port combustion chamber configurations were almost identical, along with the head bolt pattern. But here's the thing with this head. When these engines were originally designed in the late 1950s, very little was like really understood about maximum engine performance. It didn't really come around until about 10 years later, 5 to 10 years later. So these engines were introduced in 1958. So here's the exhaust port on these things. If I take like this extension and I go straight into the port, so remember now on the engine this is mounted like so, okay? And if I take this extension and I stick it in the port, straight in the port, I'm hitting the back wall of the bowl. Okay, actually I'm hitting the valve guide, but I'm hitting the back wall of the bowl. If I tilt it down some, I'm barely getting into the combustion chamber. All right. Which means that as the exhaust gases are coming out, right? Remember, they're coming out at an extremely high velocity, extremely high temperature, and we're going to do a demonstration at the end of the video to really drive this point home. The exhaust gases are coming out, hitting the roof of the port, and being somewhat slowed down and somewhat deflected back towards the exhaust valves where they're trying to get away from. The chamber shape and the chamber volume, or the port shape and the port volume, is super important because when that exhaust valve opens, it needs to evacuate as quickly as possible. It needs a clear, clean path out. That's the big block head. There's not much you can do with moving the port around. Some of the aftermarket heads have a raised port, but the general configuration of the engine dictates that the port is still going to be kind of like almost like a right angle to the combustion chamber. So that was step one. Step two, Chrysler adapts the 426 Hemi head to the wedge block. The bolt pattern on the bottom is the same. This is a D4 Hemi. This was actually designed by Westlake. This was the last step in the evolution of the iron 426 Hemi head. The production 426 Hemi head, the one that was the standard head from 1964 through 1971, when they ended production, had a drooped exhaust port. So where this engine has the port raised up high like this, the actual original head, the street Hemi head, would have the port approximately from here down. And they did this because when the engine is installed on the assembly line, there's no way for the manifold and everything to clear in a higher position. So they moved the manifold, the exhaust head of the manifold, as far down as they had to get the body drop for the assembly line. So all regular production 426 Hemi heads carry that handicap where the exhaust port is very restrictive compared to what it should be. So during the early part of the 60s, Westlake, along with some other engine builders, experimented. They understood the importance of getting the exhaust, the initial charge out of the chamber as effectively as possible. And they even experimented with things like reversing the intake for the exhaust. So they used the more handicapped exhaust side for the intake and then ran the exhaust out of, confused myself. They used the exhaust side of the head, what would normally be the exhaust side of the head, for the intake, and then routed the exhaust through the intake ports. The intake ports weren't nearly as restrictive in terms of like their curvature. So when Chrysler employed Westlake to take a look at the 426 Hemi head and make it as good as it possibly can be, what they did was they literally raised the port and created this D-shaped opening. That's where the D number comes from. The next step and the final step was the D5, and that was an aluminum head that used completely different rocker shafts and had a completely different intake manifold. These D4s use the standard 426 Hemi intake, the standard 426 Hemi rockers and everything, but that exhaust port is raised up. So all of the modern cylinder heads, like for instance the Gen 3 Hemi, feature a raised exhaust port where the port has a straight shot at the exhaust valve. Why is this so important? Again, those gases are leaving there at a tremendous velocity with a ton of heat. They don't want to change direction. If you ask it to change direction, it can set up an echo, a rebound at the roof of the port where it hits and actually try to push the mixture back down into the chamber. That's the science behind the raised exhaust port. So, what happened was, Chrysler in 1964 needed to equip its A-body cars with a V8 engine. And rather than design something from the ground up, what they did was they took the polyhead motor that had been around since the 1950s, they took the polyspherical motor, and they took the heads off of that, they used the block, the standard, what's known as the A block, and they adapted wedge cylinder heads to it. Now, one of the problems they ran into I don't have a small block head here. We're going to have to go to the shop now to shoot the rest of this because I have all my small block stuff over at the shop. But I'll show you that in a minute. One of the problems that they ran into was that the A motor had 10 cylinder head bolts. So it had, you see the way these are grouped, this bottom row here is grouped. So instead of having them spaced out like this, it had one bolt between each cylinder, which meant that when you got to the center here, you've got a head bolt. You've got two, it's a wedge now, so you've got two Siamese ports, but you can't put them down low like on these other engines because you'd be into the head bolt. So what they did was they just raised the ports. They didn't do it to make horsepower. They did it because it was a bean counter's necessity. Work what we got, make it fit. So that's what they did. And the 273 was born, the LA as we know it today. Let's go to the shop and I'll show you how that head is actually constructed and show you what happens with the exhaust. You're going to be surprised by this. So this is the small block head. Now, it's been proven, and even then, that evenly spaced exhaust ports are a better configuration. The Fords use that, the big block Chevys, modern engines, all of the modern performance engines use evenly spaced exhaust ports. But for whatever reason, Chrysler decided to Siamese the two centers. And that puts us right in line with this head bolt. So now if we put these ports where they would be on the other engines, on the other wedge engines like the big block, they would be right here and obviously no way to get to that bolt. So they moved everything up. It was a happy accident of bean counter glory, right? Because now what you end up with is an exhaust port that literally points directly at the combustion chamber. There's nothing in the way. There is an arc to it. Obviously, because you're going in two different planes here. But the point is, like, you can look straight down the exhaust port and see the entirety of the valve seat. So, why is this so important? Why is this raised port so important? I can show you on this head, even though this is a superior design to the, let's say, the big block that has those low, or even the first generation 426 Hemi that has those low exhaust ports, even on this head you could still see the handicap. So this MAP gas torch closely represents the heat and the velocity of the exhaust charge that's coming out. So watch what happens now. When I send the torch through port, look where the flame is coming through. If I squirt a little of this in here, you can get a little bit better effect. And let's close up the guide with a valve. Okay. Now you see it's all sticking to the roof of the port. And it doesn't matter where I point, here, for a little more of this. It doesn't matter where I point the flame, it still migrates to the roof. Now imagine this situation with the port down here. Obviously, there's going to be a tremendous resistance to that movement, which sets up reverb back towards the valve. This is the best setup Chrysler has ever come up with the exception of the modern Hemi. The modern Hemi has a very similar relationship on the exhaust port. So where does this leave me now? I still have a couple of big block cars. I love my big blocks. It's like a sentimental thing, you know. You got, what is this? I won't even talk about that now. But yeah, I'm not about to abandon them, and I'm still going to build my Hemi for, you know, the injected nitro motor. But I've been learning so much about these motors and finding out the way they respond to things, and it's amazing. And it actually brings me back to something that happened well, in the early 90s. I had a buddy of mine, Pete Jensen. He raced Nostalgia Top Fuel cars out on the West Coast, and I was on the East Coast at the time. And over the winter we were discussing his engine combination, you know, things that he was running, problems he was running into. They were at the 480 or 490 cubic inch size. But the NHRA had put very severe blower and fuel pump restrictions on the motor. And there was a lot of breakage, you know, a lot of damage, a lot of detonation issues, a lot of flat spots in the engines, you know. So it became very difficult to tune, very difficult to keep intact. So we talked back and forth on the phone for a couple of weeks about this and examined all of the different possibilities, all of the different ideas. And we came to the conclusion that, well, you know what, if the problem is not enough blower, not enough fuel pump, make the motor smaller to accommodate that restriction, those restrictions. So he built one at 300 and I think it was like 390 cubic inches, 395 cubic inches, and immediately right off the bat, car just flat out hauled. Breakage was gone, clutch issues were gone, everything was gone, and the car went and made tracks. I think it ran like a 590 something right off the trailer, which in those days was very impressive for those cars. And within, I would say, probably a year or two, that combination, that sub 400 cubic inch combination became the norm in the styles of top fuel. Might still be today, I don't know, I don't follow it anymore. But this leads me to my train of thought with all of the current things that I'm working on, of scaling everything back to work with this cylinder head. I know that the popular thing is to go with the 4-inch strokers and build the 408s and the 410s, and I think that working within the architecture of the LA head, working with the port size and everything that's available in this casting, because you can only do so much with the basic casting. Even, you know, you starting from scratch, you're still limited by what it's going to fit onto. I honestly believe that the way forward with these engines is to look to the smaller size. So I've been playing around with 318s, and the results I'm getting from just simple modifications or simple, you know, I'm amazed by them. So my next step with this is actually I want to try a 273. I want to do a maximum performance 273 sometime next year and see where that goes, because I honestly believe scaling the pump down to the restrictions posed by the head is the way to go for maximum bang for the buck. We'll find out. You know, it may work, it may not work. But anyway, that is it. That's why I became a small block Mopar believer. It's all right there. It's all in the exhaust port. So I know you got something out of that. I'll see you tomorrow.